I was 19 years old and going through the hardest time of my life. My parents had just divorced and I was struggling to pay for college. One rainy day, I was sitting at a bus stop, completely soaked, when an older woman approached me. She handed me her umbrella and said with a kind smile, "You deserve a little sunshine." I laughed awkwardly, not knowing what to say. We ended up talking for about 15 minutes while waiting for the bus. She told me about her own challenges as a single mom and how she always believed that small acts of kindness could change someone's day. Before leaving, she handed me a card with her number on it, saying, "If you ever need help or just someone to talk to, call me." I didn't think much of it then, but a few weeks later when I hit rock bottom and was on the verge of dropping out of college, I remembered her card. I called her. She invited me over, made me a home-cooked meal, and helped me create a plan to get my life back on track. That woman, Mrs. Geraldine, weeks later when I hit rock bottom and was on the verge of dropping out of college, I remembered her card. I called her. She invited me over, made me a home-cooked meal, and helped me create a plan to get my life back on track. That woman, Mrs. Geraldine, became like a second mom to me. Thanks to her support, I graduated and now run a scholarship fund to help students like me. So this happened last summer. I was planning a big family BBQ at my house and decided to send out invites via text. I thought I was being smart by creating a group message and adding all my relatives. But here's the thing. I had my boss's number saved as Uncle Gary because of a joke from a work meeting. I didn't realize my mistake until the day of the BBQ, when my boss texted me saying, "Looking forward to those famous ribs you mentioned." I panicked. Should I cancel? Should I tell him it was a mistake? In the end, I decided to let him come. Surprisingly, it turned out to be the best BBQ ever. My boss fit right in, joked around with my cousins, and even challenged my dad to a rib-eating contest. On Monday, he showed up at work and handed me a bottle of BBQ sauce with a note that read, "Promotion-worthy ribs. Safe to say, I'm never changing his contact name again." This is a story that has haunted me for years. My college roommate Emily was the most down-to-earth person I knew. We shared everything: class notes, late-night snacks, and even secrets. One evening, she went out to get groceries. I didn't think much of it when she didn't come back that night. I figured she stayed with her boyfriend. But days turned into weeks. Her phone was disconnected, and her boyfriend claimed they had broken up months ago. The last trace of her was a cryptic note I found under her pillow that simply said, "I'm sorry." The police launched an investigation, but found no leads. Sometimes, I wonder if I missed the signs. Was she in trouble? Did she run away? To this day, I still keep that note as a reminder to never take people for granted. My grandma was the wisest person I've ever known. She had this saying, "Treat everyone as if they're fighting a battle you can't see." I didn't understand it as a kid, but one day, it all made sense. I was working at a coffee shop during college, and one of my regular customers was this grumpy old man who never smiled and always complained about his coffee. I used to dread his visits, but one day, after my grandma's advice popped into my head, I decided to ask him how his day was. He looked surprised and then started to cry. It turned out he had just lost his wife of 50 years and didn't know how to cope. From that day on, we became friends. I learned so much about life, love, and resilience from him. My grandma's advice not only changed my perspective, but also helped me connect with someone who needed it the most. When I moved into my new neighborhood, I was completely alone. I didn't know anyone, and my anxiety made it hard to introduce myself. One day, my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Clara, showed up with a plate of cookies and said, "Welcome to the neighborhood." She ended up becoming my closest friend. Over the years, she helped me through breakups, job changes, and even taught me how to garden. She became an honorary grandmother to my kids. When she passed away, we planted a tree in her honor in the community park. Now, every time I see that tree, I'm reminded of the power of kindness. Back in high school, I had a massive crush on a girl in my class, Emily. She was the kind of person who lit up every room she entered, but I was too shy to tell her how I felt. One day, I decided to write her a love letter, but when it came time to give it to her, I chickened out. Instead, I folded the letter, put it in my jacket pocket, and walked home feeling both defeated and relieved. That's when my dog, Max, decided to change my life. Max had a habit of jumping on people when he got too excited, and this time he leapt onto Emily, who was walking her own dog nearby. In the chaos, the letter slipped out of my pocket, landing right at her feet. I panicked and tried to grab it, but Emily beat me to it. She opened it, read it on the spot, and then smiled. The kind of smile that made my knees go weak. "Well," she said, "I was hoping you'd say something like this." Max got extra treats that night. Emily and I have been together for 10 years now, and we still laugh about how our dog delivered the most important letter of my life. Growing up, my mom had this amazing lasagna recipe. She refused to share it, calling it a family secret passed down for generations. It was so good that friends would beg for leftovers, and even strangers at potlucks would ask for the recipe. One day, my curiosity got the better of me. While Mom was out, I searched through her recipe book, expecting to find a handwritten masterpiece. What I found instead was a box of Stuffer's frozen lasagna instructions taped to the back of the book. I couldn't believe it. My mom, the lasagna queen, had been passing off store-bought lasagna as her own for years. When I confronted her, she just laughed and said, "Sometimes the real secret is knowing when to let someone else do the work." Now, every time someone compliments my lasagna, I have to fight this urge to burst out laughing. There's a staircase in the woods near my hometown. It doesn't lead anywhere. Just 20 stone steps rising out of the ground, covered in moss and surrounded by trees. People say it's been there for centuries, but no one knows who built it or why. As kids, we dared each other to climb it, but everyone who did swore they heard strange whispers as they ascended. My turn came on a chilly autumn day. I made it halfway up before I heard a voice, a soft, distant cry saying, "Help me." I froze, scanning the woods for the source, but there was no one around. I bolted down the stairs and didn't stop running until I got home. Years later, I returned to the spot as an adult, determined to conquer my fear. But when I got there, the staircase was gone, replaced by an overgrown patch of grass. Locals still whisper about it, claiming it only appears to those it wants to, and it's always watching. When my grandfather passed away, we discovered a treasure trove of letters buried in his garden. Each letter was addressed to a different family member and tied to a specific plant or flower. Mine was tucked under the rose bush I helped him plant when I was 8. It read, "You've always been my little helper. Remember that life, like a garden, needs patience and care. Grow strong and don't be afraid to bloom." Reading those words felt like hearing his voice again. Each of us found comfort in his letters, and now we tend to his garden together, keeping his memory alive. For years, we had a neighbor named Mr. Peterson. He was a quiet, older man who lived alone, tending to his immaculate garden and feeding stray cats. My mom would bring him cookies on holidays, and he'd always wave when we passed by. One day, his house was suddenly empty. No moving trucks, no goodbye, just gone. When we asked around, everyone claimed Mr. Peterson had passed away years ago. Even stranger, there were no records of anyone living in that house for decades. We still don't know who or what Mr. Peterson really was. But sometimes when the wind blows just right, we hear the faint meow of a cat and smell the scent of freshly turned soil. Last Christmas, I bought a $1 lottery ticket as a joke gift for my little brother. He scratched it off, laughing about how he'd spend his non-existent winnings. Then his laughter stopped. I think I just won $50,000, he said, his face pale. We didn't believe him until we went to the lottery office and confirmed it. My brother used the money to pay off my student loans, buy our mom a new car, and donate to a local food bank. That $1 joke turned into the greatest gift our family ever received. I have a cat named Whiskers who loves stealing random objects. One day I noticed one of my left shoes was missing. I searched everywhere, under the bed, behind the couch, even in the fridge. Don't ask. A week later, I found it in Whiskers' secret stash behind the washing machine. Alongside my shoe were 3 socks, a hairbrush, and what appeared to be my neighbor's keys. Now I have to keep an eye on Whiskers, not just for my sake, but for the entire neighborhood. We joke that he's running a secret black market in our laundry room. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I was walking home from school when I noticed something strange. There was no sound. No birds, no cars, no people talking. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. I ran home to find my mom frozen mid-stir in the kitchen. She wasn't moving, blinking, or breathing. Panicking, I shook her, but she didn't respond. Then just as suddenly as it started, everything went back to normal. I told my parents, but they didn't believe me. Years later, I found an old newspaper article about the Silent Tuesday phenomenon, claiming it had happened before in our town and would likely happen again. During college, my roommate and I made a pact. Whenever one of us was having a bad night, we'd wake the other up at 3 a.m. for hot chocolate and a chat. It didn't matter if we had exams the next day or if we were exhausted. We always honored the pact. Those late-night talks got us through heartbreaks, homesickness, and existential crises. Years later, when my roommate got married, she served hot chocolate instead of champagne at the reception. "Here's to the pact that kept us sane," she said during her toast. After my grandmother passed away, we found a diary hidden in her attic. It was filled with stories about her life during the war, her secret dreams of becoming a writer, and her first love, a man she never told us about. Reading her words felt like meeting a whole new person. She wrote, "To my grandchildren, never let fear stop you from chasing your dreams. I hope my stories inspire you to write your own." Her diary now sits on my desk, a daily reminder to live boldly and love deeply. During my college years, I often pulled all-nighters to study. One night, I needed a specific book for my research and remembered a rumor about a small library on campus that supposedly only opened at midnight. Curious, I decided to check it out. Sure enough, at exactly 12 a.m., a flickering light appeared in the old, unused building near the main library. The door creaked open as I approached, and an elderly librarian greeted me with a knowing smile, saying, "You've come for answers, haven't you?" Inside, the shelves were lined with books that seemed ancient, their titles glowing faintly. I found the one I needed. It wasn't just about my research topic, but it also contained information about events in my life that hadn't happened yet. I tried to return to the library later, but it was gone, replaced by boarded-up windows and an eerie silence. To this day, I wonder if it was real or just a sleep-deprived hallucination. I was having a terrible day, missed my morning coffee, forgot my umbrella, and got caught in a downpour. By the time I made it to the subway, I looked like a drowned rat. To top it off, my phone died, and I couldn't check directions for my meeting. A stranger sitting across from me noticed my frustration. Without a word, he handed me a portable charger and a bottle of water. I hesitated, but he smiled and said, "We all need a little help sometimes." Thanks to him, I made it to my meeting on time. I never got his name, but his random act of kindness reminded me that even in a city full of strangers, there's always room for compassion. Growing up, my grandfather used to give me old coins as gifts. He said they were wishes in disguise. I didn't think much of it until years later when I started noticing a pattern. Every time I carried one of those coins with me, something extraordinary happened. A surprise job offer, finding money in my coat pocket, or even meeting my future wife. After my grandfather passed away, I found a note tucked into his coin collection. It read, "These aren't just coins, they're pieces of luck I've saved for you. Use them wisely." Now I carry one of his coins everywhere I go. Whether it's magic or coincidence, I'll never know. But it feels like he's still watching over me. My cat, Bella, has an uncanny ability to predict when someone is about to show up at our house. She'll sit by the door 5 minutes before the doorbell rings, no matter the time of day or who's visiting. One day I decided to test her. I called a friend and asked them to stop by at a random time without telling me. Sure enough, Bella parked herself by the door just before my friend arrived. We now jokingly call her Psychic Pause and half seriously believe she might be a time traveler. All I know is if Bella ever sits by the door looking worried, I'm grabbing my go bag. During a family trip to the beach, my mom lost her wedding ring. She was heartbroken, especially since it had been passed down from her grandmother. We searched for hours, but the tide came in and we assumed it was gone forever. Years later, I was walking along that same beach when something shiny caught my eye. I dug into the sand and pulled out a ring. It was my mom's. The engravings inside were still visible. When I gave it back to her, she cried tears of joy. She now wears it on a chain around her neck, saying it's proof that miracles do happen. In my office building, there's an elevator that doesn't have a button for the 13th floor. It goes from 12 to 14, which is pretty standard for superstitious reasons. But one day, as I was riding up to my floor, the elevator stopped unexpectedly, and the display read 13. The doors opened to reveal a dimly lit hallway with old-fashioned decor. Curiosity got the better of me, so I stepped out. The air felt thick, and the sound of typewriters echoed in the distance. Before I could explore further, the elevator dinged again, and the operator, a man in an outdated uniform, motioned for me to get back inside. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. When I tried to ask about it later, no one believed me. I still take the stairs whenever I can. Last week, I was waiting in line at a coffee shop when I overheard an elderly man struggling to explain what he wanted to the barista. He seemed flustered, so I stepped in to help. As we chatted, he mentioned he used to live in my neighborhood decades ago. When I told him my address, he froze and said, "That was my childhood home." We spent hours talking, and I invited him over to see the house. Watching his face light up as he walked through the rooms was priceless. He even found an old toy hidden in the attic that he thought he'd lost forever. It felt like the universe brought us together for a reason. I was browsing through a used bookstore when I found an old novel with a handwritten note tucked inside. It read, "To whoever finds this. This book got me through the hardest time in my life. I hope it helps you too. Love, a stranger." I bought the book and read it cover to cover that same night. It wasn't just the story that moved me. It was the thought that someone out there had shared a piece of their heart with a stranger. I've since started leaving notes like that in books I donate, hoping to pass on the kindness. As a kid, I used to stay at my grandmother's house every summer. Her house had a small attic window that always gave me the creeps. She told me to ignore it, saying it was just old house charm. One night I looked up and saw a shadow moving in the window. I ran inside, but no one was there. My grandma later admitted that she used to see the same shadow as a child. We never figured out what it was, but after she passed, the house was sold, and the new owners bricked up the attic window. I still dream about it sometimes. I showed up for what I thought was a casual coffee chat with a friend, only to discover it was actually a surprise job interview. My friend had mentioned me to their boss, and they wanted to meet me. I was in sweatpants and a hoodie, holding a half-eaten bagel. Somehow I managed to keep my cool, and by the end of the conversation, they offered me the job. Now, every time I walk into the office, I'm reminded that sometimes life's best opportunities come when you least expect them. Sometimes the smallest decisions lead us down the most unexpected paths. That's exactly what happened to me last summer when I stumbled upon an old clock at a garage sale. It was a hot Saturday afternoon, and I was out with my best friend Ethan. We weren't looking for anything in particular, just killing time. Then I saw it, a grandfather clock, tall and elegant, with ornate carvings on its frame. It seemed out of place amidst the cheap furniture and used appliances. Something about the clock drew me in. Its face glowed faintly, and the hands moved in an almost hypnotic rhythm. The old man running the sale noticed my interest and said, "It's a family heirloom, very rare. But beware, it doesn't always keep regular time." He chuckled as if it were a joke, but there was something in his eyes that made me uneasy. "Nah, I bought the clock anyway." Back home, the clock fit perfectly in the corner of my living room. For the first few days, it seemed like a regular antique. Beautiful, but unremarkable. Then strange things started happening. At first, it was little things. I'd check the time and notice the hands were moving backward, only to correct themselves moments later. Then I started hearing faint ticking noises, even when I was in other rooms. One night, I woke up to the sound of the clock chiming, even though it didn't have a chime mechanism. When I went to investigate, the hands were spinning wildly. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized the clock wasn't just a decorative piece, it was alive. The next morning, I noticed something even stranger. My phone showed the same notification from the day before. When I checked the news, the headlines were identical to the previous mornings. I shrugged it off, thinking it was a glitch. But as the day went on, I experienced an unsettling déjà vu. Conversations repeated word for word. My actions felt like reruns of a TV show. Ethan stopped by in the evening, and I told him what was happening. He laughed at first, but grew serious when the clock began glowing faintly. "This thing's creepy," he said. "Maybe you should get rid of it." Before I could respond, the clock's hands stopped moving entirely. A second later, time seemed to freeze. Ethan's expression froze mid-sentence. The ticking of the clock stopped, and even the breeze outside went still. Then, everything restarted, but not in the way I expected. Instead of my living room, I found myself standing in a dimly lit workshop. Gears and clock parts surrounded me, and the air smelled of oil and sawdust. A man stood at a workbench, meticulously assembling a clock. He was tall and gaunt, with piercing eyes that seemed to see right through me. "You shouldn't be here," he said without looking up. "Where am I?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The past," he replied. "My past." He introduced himself as Ambrose, a clockmaker cursed to create timepieces that manipulated reality. Each clock, he explained, trapped its owner in a loop of their most significant regrets or fears. "Time is not linear," he said. "It's a web, and every choice you make adds another thread." I begged him to tell me how to break the curse, but he only said, "You'll have to face your own threads first." Suddenly, I was back in my living room. The clock chimed again, and the room shifted around me. I wasn't alone. Shadows of my past filled the space. Old arguments, missed opportunities, moments I wished I could forget. The most haunting vision was of my father. We hadn't spoken in years, and seeing him again brought a flood of emotions. I tried to speak to him, to apologize for the way things ended, but he disappeared before I could. Each chime of the clock pulled me deeper into these moments, forcing me to confront them head-on. Some memories were joyful, others painful, but all of them felt real. Ethan tried to help, but he was pulled into his own loop. I watched helplessly as he relived a traumatic event from his childhood. The clock didn't just affect me, it consumed everyone around it. Desperate to escape, I returned to the workshop in one final vision. Ambrose was waiting for me, his expression somber. "You've seen your threads," he said. "Now you must decide. Will you cut them or weave them into something new?" I didn't fully understand what he meant, but I knew I couldn't keep living in the past. I smashed the clock with a hammer, and for a moment, everything went dark. When I woke up, the clock was gone, and time had returned to normal. Ethan remembered nothing of the loops, and my phone no longer repeated old notifications. But I wasn't the same. The experience had changed me. I reached out to my father and started making amends. Ambrose's words stayed with me. Time is a web, and every choice adds a thread. There's something about the woods that makes you feel both alive and utterly vulnerable. Maybe it's the isolation or the silence that's broken only by the rustle of leaves. Whatever it is, I've always found it unsettling. That's why I was hesitant when my friends suggested a weekend trip to a remote cabin deep in the forest. "Come on, it'll be fun," Jess said. "Just us, no distractions, and no cell service." Against my better judgment, I agreed. The cabin was exactly as advertised, charming, rustic, and miles away from civilization. But from the moment we arrived, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. We spent the first evening settling in. The cabin had a warm, cozy vibe, with a stone fireplace, creaky wooden floors, and walls lined with old books. There was no electricity, just lanterns and candles for light. While exploring, I found a journal tucked away in a drawer. Its leather cover was cracked with age, and the pages were filled with neat handwriting. The entries described a previous group of visitors who had stayed at the cabin years ago. At first, the journal seemed mundane, accounts of hiking, cooking, and stargazing. But as I read further, the tone shifted. The entry spoke of strange noises at night, shadows moving in the trees, and a growing sense of dread. The last entry chilled me to the bone. "They're here. If you find this, leave while you can." That night, we built a fire and shared stories. Everyone laughed and drank, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods were too quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Around midnight, we heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the back door. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Jess joked that it was probably a raccoon, but no one volunteered to check. Eventually, Ethan grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. "Nothing," he said, shining the beam into the darkness. But just as he closed the door, the tapping started again, this time at the front. We spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every creak and shadow. The next morning, I decided to read more of the journal. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The entries began to mirror our own experiences, the tapping noises, the uneasy feeling, even the jokes Jess had made around the fire. I showed the others, but they dismissed it as a coincidence. "You're just freaking yourself out," Ethan said. But as the day went on, the parallels became impossible to ignore. Jess found another journal in a hidden compartment under the floorboards. This one was older, its pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was different, but the stories were the same. It was as if every group that stayed in the cabin had experienced the same sequence of events. That night, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent. This time, it came from all sides of the cabin. Doors, windows, even the roof. We barricaded ourselves inside, but the noises didn't stop. The journals hinted at a pattern. The tapping was a warning. The real danger came after the third night, when people began disappearing. We tried to leave the next morning, but the forest seemed to conspire against us. The trail we had used to get to the cabin was gone, replaced by dense undergrowth. Our compass spun wildly, and every direction led us back to the cabin. Panic set in as we realized we were trapped. On the third night, the shadows came. They started as faint shapes in the corners of the room, barely visible in the flickering candlelight. As the night wore on, they grew bolder, moving closer and taking on humanoid forms. Jess screamed when one of the shadows reached out, its hand passing through her like smoke. She collapsed, unconscious, and we dragged her to the bedroom, barricading the door. Ethan and I spent the night keeping watch, but the shadows didn't leave. They whispered in low, guttural tones, their words unintelligible but filled with malice. When dawn finally broke, Jess was gone. Ethan and I scoured the cabin and the surrounding woods, calling Jess's name. We found her journal open on the floor, the final entry written in shaky handwriting. "They've taken me. Don't let them take you too." Ethan snapped, blaming me for everything. We fought, and in the chaos, he ran into the woods, ignoring my pleas to stay together. I never saw him again. Determined to survive, I returned to the cabin and studied the journals. They all described a ritual, an offering that could break the curse. It required burning the journals and leaving a personal item behind. I gathered the journals, lit a fire in the fireplace, and threw them in. The shadows screamed as the flames consumed the pages. I left my watch on the mantle as an offering and walked into the woods, unsure if I would find freedom or my own end. As I walked, the forest seemed to shift around me. The trees parted, revealing the trail we had lost. I ran until I reached the edge of the woods and found a road. A passing car stopped, and the driver, an elderly man, asked if I was okay. "You're lucky," he said when I told him where I'd been. "That cabin's been abandoned for decades. No one who goes there ever comes back." I didn't tell him about the journals or the shadows. I didn't tell anyone, but sometimes late at night, I hear tapping on my windows, and I wonder if I truly escaped, or if the cabin is still with me. Every town has its quirks, but none were quite like Mayfield. I grew up hearing whispers about it, a place where time stood still and people vanished without a trace. Some said the town didn't exist at all, just a story parents told their kids to keep them out of the woods. But curiosity has a way of pulling you into places you don't belong. For me, it started with an old map I found in my grandfather's attic. The map was simple, a grid of streets labeled with strange names like Ecliptic Avenue and Nebula Court. In the center was a note written in my grandfather's shaky handwriting, "Never forget Mayfield." I was determined to find the town. Armed with the map and a tank full of gas, I set out on a crisp autumn morning. The directions were straightforward at first, leading me down winding country roads. But as I got closer, things began to change. The trees lining the road grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead like a tunnel. The air felt heavier, and my GPS stopped working. Eventually, the road narrowed to a dirt path that ended abruptly at a rusted sign. Faded letters spelled out, "Welcome to Mayfield." Mayfield was unlike any town I'd ever seen. The streets were eerily quiet, lined with old-fashioned houses that looked as though they hadn't been touched in decades. There were no cars, no sounds of life, just an oppressive stillness. I walked through the empty streets, my footsteps echoing off the cracked pavement. The strangest thing was the clock tower in the town square. Its hands were frozen at 3:33, yet I could hear a faint ticking sound. As I explored, I noticed something else. Photographs taped to the windows of every house. They were black and white images of people, each staring directly at the camera with solemn expressions. I was standing in front of one of the houses when I heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't words, just a sound, but it sent a chill down my spine. Turning around, I saw a figure in the distance. It was a woman wearing a long dress, her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. She stood perfectly still, watching me. When I called out to her, she turned and walked away, disappearing around a corner. Against my better judgment, I followed her. The alley she had turned into was empty, but I found something else, a journal lying on the ground. Its cover was embossed with the initials MH. The journal was a record of someone's life in Mayfield. The entries described the town as vibrant and full of life, but as I read on, the tone grew darker. One entry stood out. The forgetting started last week. It began with small things, names, dates, faces. Now I can't even remember my own family. Mayfield is fading, and so are we. The last page was a frantic scrawl. "We are the photographs. Do not look back." I felt a sudden urge to leave, but the streets had changed. The houses seemed closer together. Their windows darkened. The air grew colder, and the whispering grew louder. I ran back to the town square, but the clock tower was different. Its hands were moving backward, ticking louder with each second. A voice spoke behind me. "You shouldn't have come." It was the woman in the hat. Up close, her face was pale and expressionless, her eyes like empty voids. "Mayfield doesn't let anyone leave," she said. "Not once you've seen it." She explained that the town was trapped in a loop, its residents slowly erasing themselves from existence. The photographs in the windows weren't just pictures. They were the people who had been forgotten. I refused to believe her. Clutching the journal, I ran to my car and started the engine. The road out of Mayfield appeared ahead, but as I drove, the landscape shifted. The dirt path looped back into the town square, no matter which direction I went. The woman's words echoed in my mind, "Do not look back." Desperate, I decided to burn the journal. If Mayfield's history was tied to its curse, destroying it might break the cycle. I lit a match and dropped it onto the pages. The fire spread quickly, and for a moment, the whispering stopped. As the journal burned, the town began to crumble. The houses collapsed into dust. The clock tower shattered, and the photographs in the windows disintegrated. I found myself standing in an open field, the remains of Mayfield scattered around me. My car was gone, and the only thing left was the rusted sign. I walked until I reached a highway where a passing truck driver picked me up. When I told him what had happened, he gave me a strange look. "There's no town out there," he said, "just woods for miles." But as I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it, a black and white photograph of myself taped to the back of the truck.